Paige Rogers, and today I am going to be cooking a Taco Bell Supreme Crunchwrap for the FFA challenge.
And what are you doing?
I am washing my hands to make sure I don't put any contaminants into my food. So before I fry my meat, I'm going to put in some onions and garlic and saute them just a little bit, and they will continue cooking as I cook my meat. They'll just get finely chopped with it. Adding garlic is kind of my own little thing. I like garlic, and you can never go wrong with a little bit of it. So when cooking, you're going to want the handle of your your skillet to be out of the way. That way you don't bump into it or knock it over while you're cooking. And it also gives you a little bit of leverage, that way it doesn't shake on the stove if your stove is set up like ours, unless it's a flat top, then you can still hold on to it if you want. So I'm going to saute this a little bit, and then I'm going to add it. I'm going to turn up the heat a little bit because it was on low, just sizzling. So I'm going to saute this, and then I'm going to add in my meat and finally chop it up. So the first thing I did is I put a little bit of avocado oil in the pan because I'm about to fry up some meat. And I'm gonna take my spatula, and once I have this going, I'm gonna make sure to keep the meat finely chopped. That way it doesn't ball up and make our recipe too big. So I'm going to add in my ground beef, and as you saw in the video beforehand, I did wash my hands. So we're gonna add that in and chop it up into smaller pieces. These are like hamburger patties, what the heck? Well, I am finally chopping up my meat so it is at a smaller consistency, and I'll keep doing this throughout the process of cooking the ground beef, just to make sure that it's in nice, more of like a round consistency of little kind of like pebbles. That way it's not all just one slab of ground beef. And so you don't have to, I'm going to go ahead and fast forward to whenever it's not completely done. It's still a little pink, but as it's starting to cook down and the juice is starting to simmer and all of my ingredients are starting to finish up cooking, I'm going to add a taco seasoning that I made a few days prior. It's got some salt and pepper, paprika, a little bit of cayenne pepper, and it's just rather than going to the store and buying some, it's one that I was able to make with some ingredients I had here at the house. So I'm going to add that in just to get it nice and flavored. And I'm going to make sure to put my lid back on it, that way we don't dump it over, because accidents happen. So I'm going to mix that in, and then I'm also going to mix in some flour to add a little bit of thickness to the juice and flavors, just because we're going to be using the juice and grease a little later on for near the end of our project. And so once I have that done, I'm going to go ahead and add my flour. I made sure to wash my hands before coming back to this, that way I've got clean hands so I'm not contaminating my food again. So I'm going to take fine corn flour, which is a healthier substitute than regular flour, but not 100%, it's still flour. And just a small handful of it, and sprinkle it in. And then we're going to mix it in to help thicken that grease. And I'll add a little bit more in just a minute once I get this mixed in and it starts to cook into the meat. And then I'll also add a little bit more flavoring as well with the seasoning, since that was just kind of sitting on top. I still had a lot more meat that needed to be flavored down. So I'm going to add a little bit more of the flour. And in this, I'm keeping my distance from the pan, because as this starts to cook and the flour cooks down with the grease, it's going to bubble, and you don't want to get burnt by the grease. And I'm keeping my hands steady on the pan, that way it doesn't jiggle and accidentally fall. If you would like to come look and see what the meat would look like. So you want it to be finely chopped and have those individual pieces in there. Whereas before it was more of like a slab. And you can see that the consistency of the grease is starting to get a little thicker than what it was before. I don't know if you were able to see that. But it's starting to thicken. And so I'm going to add a little bit more flavoring, and then I will come back whenever I start on my next step. So what I just did while I was off camera, I went ahead and transferred my ground beef to a plate with a paper towel underneath. That way it can soak up some of the excess grease and juice. What I did make sure to do is I made sure to leave some of this flavor of grease, and we're going to use that near the end of the video to fry up the rest of our food. So as you can tell, it's not very healthy, but it should taste good. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to dice a tomato, which will be part of our ingredients that we're going to add to our tortilla that has all of our fixings on it. I'm using a serrated knife, that way it cuts through the tomato skin nicer rather than a butter knife, which would just squish everything out. And the same thing goes for a cutting knife, like a knife like this. It would just squish everything out. So with using a serrated knife, I'm going to keep my fingers out of the way. That way I don't cut myself. And whenever you cut away from people, including yourself. So make sure to cut in the opposite direction. Don't cut towards yourself. Which is a thing I think everybody learned in chemistry as well. So I'm going to dice this tomato and just make sure I have everything where it needs to be. And we're going to have it in more or less little cubes rather than a giant slice of tomato that you would see like on a burger. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divvy out the meat onto 3 different tortillas because I'm feeding my family this evening with this. So initially I'm just going to separate it out, and if I have extra, then I will add more to each one. Bubba Chunk, please get out of the kitchen. So I'm going to make sure that all of these are fairly even. Okay, come on, let's go this way once we're done with this. He does not need to be in the video, Mom. He's not the cook.
But he's cute.
He is cute, you're right, but he's a scavenger. He's a little rat. That's okay. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do, now that we've divvied out all of the meat, we're going to add our tostada shells. So we're going to set that there and that there. There's a filter one. Need a burrito, more packaging. So I'm adding the tostada shells onto the meat, and once that is done, I'm going to take sour cream and I'm going to spread that on top of the tostada shell. And then I'm just going to make sure to spread it out. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add our leafy greens. So we're going to just make a nice little pile on top for each one. Rather than using lettuce, we're using superfood greens. You know, healthy for unhealthy. You know, to balance everything out. Perfectly balanced as it should be. So there's those. We're going to add a little bit more of that. And we're going to add some over here. So the next thing we're going to add is we're going to add the tomato slices that I diced previously. And we're just going to add those on top. And we're going to do that with each one of them. Okay. And I'm going to wash my hands. So I just got finished washing my hands again, and I'm going to add my cheese. We're using an organic cheese, just, you know, let's balance out the bad food for you. As you can tell, that's a reoccurring theme. I apologize for the dog in the background who's wanting to intervene and help in my instructions. Okay, so now that we have that done, we're going to fold the tortilla. So it's going to start out like that. And we're going to fold this in. The tortilla is deciding to break on me. This in, and we're just going to continue doing that all the way around. And it does not look pretty, but we're not here for prettiness. So I'm going to go ahead and start heating up my pan again, and I am going to gently fold my tortilla so it does not crumble into pieces of cardboard. And I'm going to just continually fold it and crimp it around the edges. And as I'm doing this, my grease that I kept from my previous cooking to basically fry this. We're gonna do it like here. I need the spatula out of the way. So we're going to, hang on, I don't think that's enough grease. So I added a little bit of butter to my mixture, that way I had a little bit more grease to fry with. And we're going to put it face down. Use a spatula to hold it down. And we're going to let it sit there for about 2 minutes or until brown. That way it can start sticking together. And the cheese will melt to help do that. There we go. Just try and tuck it back into place. So I'm going to set a timer. We're going to let it sit there and cook. And I will look on the other side in about 45 seconds just to check and make sure it's starting to brown and to see an estimate about how long I need it to continue to stay that way. And I'm going to do the same thing for the rest of the tortillas as well. And then I will show you the finished product and cut it and show you what it looks like on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it. I had a chance to look at it and it's starting to brown. It should look like that. Ooh, that looks pretty good. So you see there's the melted cheese that's helping hold this tortilla together. I know my tortilla kind of came unfolded as I was putting it in the pan, but it's still holding itself together. So I'm going to let this sit for another little bit. We'll let it sit for another, we'll go ahead and say minute 45. We'll check it about halfway through that time and just make sure it's starting to brown on the bottom. I'm going to turn up the heat, that way my grease and other mixture is starting to bubble and sizzle, and make sure that it decides to brown. So now I'm going to take the final product off the stove. I'm letting the little bit of butter that was down at the bottom drip off through the spatula, and there you go. And we'll cut into it and look at it in just a minute. So I'm going to just go ahead and cut this open and show y'all what the inside looks like. See, I didn't get all the way through apparently. There we go. That should be all the way through now. There we go. You can see on the inside you have your meat, and then the tostada shell is right there. And then you've got your lettuce, and there's your sour cream, and you've got your tomato, and then your cheese has melted all into the tortilla.